on to painting the color coats. Be sure to read pages 75 through 88 in your polyfiber manual concerning the color coats before beginning. The first decision you will have to make is what kind of paint you want to use. This boils down to a question of how you want the airplane to look: a glossy, shiny, wet look, or a more traditional satin finish, and what kind of use or abuse the airplane will get. If you want the airplane to have a semi-gloss, antique-like finish, you will be spraying Polytone as your final color coat. If you want the airplane to have a wet look, high gloss finish, you will be spraying Aerothane, a polyurethane paint. There are pros and cons to using either, and these are clearly outlined in your polyfiber manual. No matter what your selection, Polytone or Aerothane, you need to have a good spray rig and an appropriate place to spray. Regardless of the kind of spray system you use, you will need two different needle-nozzle air cap combinations if you're going to use Aerothane as your final color coat. Polybrush and Polyspray can be applied in much more volume than Aerothane, so you can use a wider needle-nozzle air cap combination. HVLP, high-volume, low-pressure systems, can be run from a compressor, or you could invest in a turbine-powered HVLP system. These are advantageous since they produce much less overspray mist in the air and put more paint on the surface. Where to paint? Having the right environment in which to spray is important when using Polytone, and downright critical if using Aerothane. Either way, your best bet is to construct a simple paint booth. Read pages 76 and 77 in your polyfiber manual for ideas on this. You could also rent or borrow a professional paint booth, but be sure you can leave the surfaces you paint in the booth until they are dry. In other words, overnight. Okay, you have a good paint rig. You have taken our advice and practiced with it until you have a pretty high comfort level and consistent results. You have built a paint booth in the hangar or garage. You are ready to paint. You're ready to begin the always interesting and sometimes frustrating experience of applying color coats. Think about this for a moment. Some of your airplane, the fabric parts, are silver. Some parts, the aluminum, are probably primed in green or brown. Maybe fiberglass parts are tan. In other words, if you leave things the way they are, you are going to paint the first color coat over different base colors. These different base colors will cause a slightly different tone in the final color coat unless you apply a lot of paint to each piece. The idea, though, is to paint as few color coats as possible to get coverage and a consistent tone over the whole airplane. What can you do to solve this? Start with an entirely white airplane. Everything: aluminum, fabric, fiberglass, the works. Here's how. On the aluminum and fiberglass, prime with Polyfiber EP-420 epoxy primer. It comes in white. That takes care of all the parts that aren't fabric. Spray one light coat of white Polytone on all the fabric parts. Now every piece of the plane starts out the same, white. This will give you better coverage in fewer coats and a much brighter color tone, particularly if you are spraying colors other than the whites. We are going to spray some orange Polytone on the stabilizer so you can see how the final product will look. Mixing any paint is critical. If you don't get all the pigment off the bottom of the can and into suspension before spraying, the paint won't be the color you want, and different spray days will result in different colors from the same can if it isn't mixed completely every time you use it. You must use a paint shaker. If you don't know someone around the airport that has one, take your paint to the automotive paint store or hardware store and have it put on a double-action paint shaker for at least 5 minutes. Use it within a week of shaking. Ready to spray? As always, first clean the entire surface with C2210 paint cleaning solvent and gently wipe it with a tack cloth. Thin Polytone 4 parts Polytone to 1 part reducer. As before, use either RR8500 or R65-75 depending on the temperature. Use blush retarder if it's humid. Pour Polytone into the paint gun cup through the 60x48 mesh strainer. One of the very good things about Polytone is that it sprays exactly like Polybrush and Polyspray. You've already got this all figured out. Just as with all the other coats you have sprayed, Start with the perimeter of the piece, then spray a mist coat on the main surface. When the mist coat is dry, spray a wet color coat. Try to spray just enough to wet the surface uniformly without flooding it. Let the first coat dry and do it all again. 2 coats may be enough, 3 at the most. Remember, the object is to apply the minimum number of coatings to do the job. Polytone is very flexible, but even it will crack if it's really piled on. After reading the section in your polyfiber manual on color coats, you may elect to use aerothane or a combination of polytone and aerothane. Your choice. Just remember to practice first until you can get a good-looking job, whether the practice piece is positioned vertically or horizontally. Whether you use polytone or aerothane, before taping and spraying any trim colors, let the paint dry at least 12 hours. Let's take the stabilizer for one burst just to show how it's done.